Well, good afternoon. Today we're going to take a look at smart objects and just how you might use them in your workflow in Photoshop. First of all, we should probably start off by taking a look at just what smart objects are. So a smart object is like taking an image and placing it inside a box. The box protects the image inside. You can do what you want to the box itself, but the image inside is not altered by whatever you've done to the box. Externally, you may be changing the appearance of the image a bit, but the actual image inside the smart object hasn't been changed. So how can you recognize a smart object? In the lower layer here, you'll notice a little icon in the lower right-hand corner of the image thumbnail, and that icon indicates that layer is a smart object. Notice that the layer above it does not have that little icon and therefore is not a smart object. So how do you open an image from Lightroom into Photoshop as a smart object? The easiest way, of course, is to right-click on the image, which brings up the menu that you're probably familiar with. You go to Edit In. Normally you might be used to just editing in Photoshop, choosing that as the option. Instead, if you go down the list, you'll find that there's an option that says Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. If you click on that, and in a moment it will open in Photoshop as a smart object. So now the image is opened in Photoshop, and you can see in the layer the little icon in the corner of the thumbnail that indicates that it is a smart object. Now, one of the basic uses or advantages of opening an image as a smart object is that you retain access to Camera Raw. So in a sense, you retain access to all the sliders, all the tools that you have in Lightroom, but now you're in Photoshop, or more particularly in Camera Raw. So if you double click on the thumbnail, it will open that image in Camera Raw. So now that it's open in Camera Raw, you can see that you have the sliders that you would have access to in Lightroom. So you can adjust things like the exposure, highlights, whatever, bring down the whites, darks, change saturation, do whatever you want, whatever you would normally do in Lightroom. Perhaps you made your original edits in Lightroom and now just want to tweak them a little bit now that you got it into Photoshop. This is the way to do it. And click OK, and it will close Camera Raw and take you back into Photoshop, where after a moment or two your changes will be applied to the image. So now you can see that the changes we made in Camera Raw have now been applied to the image back in Photoshop. So now we'll just back out of those changes and take a look at another couple of features of smart objects, that being how you can duplicate layers. Occasionally, for one reason or another, you may need to create or duplicate a smart object layer, and there are two ways of doing it, and there's important differences between the two. If you do what normally you do to duplicate a layer and just choose duplicate layer or Control or Command J, Photoshop will create a second copy of that layer. But if you use this method, it's important to note that those two smart objects are linked together. So whatever you change in one layer, it will change the other smart object layer the same way. So if I now open this top layer in Camera Raw by double-clicking on it, and with the image opened in Raw, if I again make some changes to it, maybe change the vibrance and the exposure, and click on OK, it takes it back into Photoshop. And in a moment it'll apply those changes. But notice that those changes have been applied to both layers. If I click the top layer off and on, you'll see that the same changes have been applied to the lower layer. So in most cases, this is not the way you want to create a new layer or a duplicate layer of a smart object. There is a better way of creating a duplicate layer where you can make changes to that second layer that don't automatically feed back to the original layer. So instead of using duplicate layer or Control J, if you right click on the layer and brings up the various menu options, and if you scroll down to where it says New Smart Object via Copy and select that, you'll again create a second layer, which is essentially a copy of the original one, and at this stage kind of looks like we saw previously. But if we make changes to this layer, for example, you again open it in Camera Raw, once again in Camera Raw we'll make some changes such as, again, this time let's really darken it, bring up the whites, bring down the shadows, and click on OK. It will apply those images or those changes to the top layer, but notice if I turn off the top layer, the bottom layer, or the original smart object, hasn't been changed. So creating a new layer by copy, or creating a new smart object by copy, is a way of creating another smart object, but not having it linked back to the original smart object. And most applications, this is the way you want to go. Incidentally, those that have Tony Kuiper's TK7 panel, I'll just open it back up. I had TK8, the beta panel, open. Tony Kuiper in his panel has essentially a button right up here that if you click on that, you will create a new layer via copy. So that saves you of using the right click menu. And as with many of Tony Kuiper's panel buttons, they're just shortcuts to what you can do by other means in Photoshop. Another type of smart object that you might want to create from within Photoshop is if you open your image as a smart object and then make various changes to it. So let's say you open up a curves adjustment layer, And yeah, maybe add a little contrast to the image. You open up a hue saturation layer. And let's say you oops. Sorry, I just had to backtrack there. I opened up a black and white layer rather than a hue saturation layer. So let's say you wanted to desaturate some of the colors in the sky. And let's say you created multiple layers of one kind or another. And you wanted to simplify your layer stack. Or, as we'll see, there's other reasons for doing this. I'll show you some other applications a little bit later. But if you highlight all of your layers by clicking on the top one and then clicking Shift and click on the top one, click Shift and click on the bottom one to select all the layers, and then right click and click on Convert to Smart Object. It will take all of those layers and essentially create a new Smart Object layer, which includes within it all of these adjustment layers. So it'll take Photoshop a moment to do this. My apologies in starting and stopping the recording. I think I didn't hit start at one point, so I'm having to backtrack a bit here. Unfortunately, I have to do this recording as a one take. I can stop and start it, but I can't splice pieces together. So my apologies for what's probably going to be a bit of a break or unexplained change in the what you're seeing on the screen. Anyway, I've created a hue saturation layer and changed the saturation of the sky. Now there's times when you may want to, if you've got a whole bunch of layers stacked up here, you may want to simplify the appearance of your stack, or there are other applications that we'll see later on where you may want to combine all these layers into a new smart object. So if you click on the top layer and using Shift and click on the bottom layer to select all the layers, and then right click and choose Convert to Smart Object, it will combine all of those layers into a new smart object that, as we'll see, actually still has those individual layers within it, but you will only see, on this screen anyway, you'll only see one layer representing the combined smart object. So Photoshop has now combined those layers into one new smart object. And you may wonder, well, where did those other layers go? How can I get at them if I want to make a change? And it's very simple. Once again, you double click on the thumbnail, but now it won't open this in Camera Raw. What it will do is open a second image which has those layers in it. So I'll double click and we'll give Photoshop a moment to open up the sort of embedded smart object. So now you'll see that Photoshop has opened a second image, which really is the image that we previously had. You can see the layers here, and these layers are embedded in that single layer. In, if we go back to this image, the first one here, you'll notice that there's just the one layer here, which is a smart object, but within Photoshop, this other image is the embedded layers. So we can now go to these adjustment layers, and we can make further changes. And if we save those changes, so just, you can go up to File, click on Save. It saves those changes back into the original layer and into that smart object we created that was a combination of these layers. So once it finishes saving, we're 99% now, in a moment it'll finish saving. We can now close this layer or this image that has those other layers in it, because we've saved all this back into the original image. So we'll close that. Just click on the X there, and notice that we have imported those changes back into the image. For example, if I look at the history, if I go back and go back to the beginning, here's the original smart object. We create a new smart object by layers. Oh, pardon me, it's taking me through too much of the history. I didn't go, or I went too far back in the history. Just give me a second here. Okay, there's one of the layers we created. There's another layer, and so on down to where we converted all those layers into a new smart object. Then we went in, opened that smart object, and made some changes, imported them back, and now those changes are showing up in the original image. Okay, let's take a look at how we can use smart objects, or a few ways that we can use smart objects in workflow in Photoshop. So I'm sure you will find these uses absolutely amazing. We've already touched on the first one, that's retaining use of Camera Raw within Photoshop. Also going to take a look at using smart filters and plugins in a non-destructive manner, making use of smart objects. Take a look at using smart objects in raw processing. And finally, take a look at using smart objects in conjunction with tools such as Transform or Liquify. So first of all, we'll talk about using or retaining the use of Camera Raw, and actually we've kind of already covered this. So as I mentioned, we can open an image as a smart object in Photoshop. And as I previously mentioned, once in Photoshop, if you double click on that layer, you will open the image in Camera Raw. So let's just take a look at that again. Double click on it. It'll take a moment for Photoshop to open it in Camera Raw. And as before, in Camera Raw, we can make changes to the image. Again, perhaps fine-tuning what we had done in Lightroom. So essentially anything you could do in Lightroom using any Lightroom tools, a radial filter, graduated filter, whatever, we can also do in Camera Raw or fine-tune some of those changes. So let's just add a bit of contrast to the image. We will click OK, which will close Camera Raw and take us back into Photoshop and import those changes or make those changes to the Smart Objects layer. Photoshop's just finishing up. And there you can see that the changes appeared back in Photoshop. So essentially you retain the functions that you had in Lightroom, but now you're working in Photoshop and Camera Raw, which saves you from going back to Lightroom. Obviously, if you went back to Lightroom and made changes in Lightroom, you would then have to open that as a new image in Photoshop. It wouldn't change this particular image. That can become critical or become a feature if you've made a few adjustment layers to this and decide that maybe you want to warm up the basic image or do some minor change. You can go back to the base layer, the Smart Object layer, open that in Camera Raw, maybe warm up the image, import it or close it out and bring it back into Photoshop. Those layers that you added above will still apply, but you've changed the bottom layer and perhaps now warmed up the image or made what other change you wanted to make. Now there is a caution in doing this, and let's just take a look at that. If you've created a bunch of layers above, such as a new layer, you've used the clone stamp and maybe, or let's just say the, oops, click on the right button here, the spot healing brush. Maybe you've tried to paint out the sign over here. And maybe successfully or not successfully. We'll see in a moment. Gotten rid of that sign. Well, okay, it was just a quick change. But if you go back and change the base layer, change the exposure, warm it up or whatever, that clone stamp or that layer here, the removing that sign, that's based on the colors and so on in this image. So if you go back and change the original image, you're not going to be changing that stamp or the cloned layer there. So it may end up looking kind of weird, and you may end up just having to redo your clone layer to make it match the new exposures underneath. But it can still save you a bit of time rather than going back into Lightroom and starting over from scratch again. I'll just get rid of that layer, or that stamp layer, or clone stamping layer. And now let's look at a second use of Smart Objects. So we've dealt with briefly retaining the use of Camera Raw using a smart object. The second use that I mentioned is to use smart filters and plugins in a non-destructive manner. So let's take a look at that. We will open an object or open an image from Lightroom into Photoshop. So here we have that same garden scene open in Photoshop as a smart object. Let's say we want to do some sharpening on it. So we can go up to top where it says filter, and let's say we want to use Topaz Sharpen AI. So we go down to Topaz Labs and choose Topaz Sharpen AI, and that will open the image in Sharpen AI. So in the interest of time, I didn't show you it opening in Sharpen AI and then processing and bring it back into Photoshop. But you can see that underneath the Smart Object layer here, you can see a layer that says Smart Filters, and below that Topaz Sharpen AI. So that indicates that the Topaz Sharpen AI plugin has sharpened this image, and it's been brought back into Photoshop. And we can turn that sharpening on and off. It may not be overly visible, just depending on how much sharpening was done. And screen resolution and so on doesn't really show it that well, but it did sharpen it a bit. Because we used a smart object and a smart filter, I could, and I'm not going to, I could double click on that and open this back in Topaz and could adjust the sharpening on it. Incidentally, I obviously earlier paused the recording while it went into Sharpen AI and back again. Recording all of this really slows down any processing. That round trip to Sharpen AI probably took a good 20 minutes. So thankfully I didn't make everybody sit through that. There's a couple of things just to note here that with quite often with the plugins and so on, if you double click and open the plugin again, it remembers the settings that you had in that plugin, and you can further adjust them. The Topaz products seem to be one exception to that, and if I open this again, pretty much it's like opening the image for the first time into Sharpen or whatever other Topaz plugin you use, and you essentially have to make the changes all over again. For other plugins such as On One, if you make some changes, bring it back into Photoshop, and you want to tweak those changes, you can double click on the smart object, or pardon me, the smart filter layer, open it back up in whatever plugin, On One plugin you were using, and your previous changes will still be there, and then you can just tweak those changes. So hopefully Topaz will also show that or behave that way in some time in the future, but at the moment that's something to keep in mind, that that's sort of an exception to what normally happens. So that's one way you can use smart objects using smart filters such as Topaz. You haven't really changed, again, you haven't changed the smart object layer, you've just added some more processing on top of that layer, or in this case below it, but the processing affects the appearance, but you can turn it off and on, and the basic layer hasn't changed. The smart object itself hasn't changed. Let's say you wanted to manually blend exposure bracketed images. So you can see in Lightroom here I have sort of a normal exposure, dark, and a light exposure. Highlight all three and click Edit in and go down and open them as smart objects. And they would open in Photoshop. Here they don't open as layers, they open as three separate images in Photoshop. So there's the normal, there's the dark exposure, and there's the bright exposure. Now you can manually combine those three into one image with layers, or all three images represented as layers within that one image by using the Move tool. Most of you have probably done this. I'll select the dark image and using the Move tool and the Shift key, click on it and then drag up to the normal image till it shows up, and then drag down into the image and then release the mouse, and now you can see it's got the two layers, the dark layer and the base layer. Do the same thing again with the bright layer. Got the Move tool, press the Shift key, drag it up to the base image till that image appears, and then drag it back down, release, and now you can see all three layers there. The bright layer, the dark layer, and the base layer. And then you can go and close out these other bright and dark image because you no longer need those. We've got copies of those layers all included as layers within one image here. For those that have the Tony Kuiper panel, I'm just going to delete those two layers again. Tony Kuiper panel has an action that will automatically stack those images. You just click on Stack, and it takes a moment. But it stacks the three images and closes out the two versions that you're no longer using. So in the interest of time, I've gone ahead and blended these exposures. I haven't shown it here because this is a presentation on smart objects, not on digital blending. But if I just go back and start off, there's the base layer that I had made some exposure adjustments to, blended in the dark layer, and then blended in the bright layer. And that's the final result, or as far as I've gotten so far. Now let's say you've gotten this far and decide that maybe you would like to change the exposure a little bit in the base layer, which is back in, I've turned off the other two layers, that's this layer. If I double click on that, I can open that in Camera Raw. And once Camera Raw opens, let's just say that I kind of wanted to cool down the foreground a little bit, so I can adjust the temperature, click on OK, and that takes me back into Photoshop. And it'll take Photoshop a moment and apply that change. Now you can see that the base layer has been cooled down. I'll turn the other layers back on. And that cooling of the base layer has now affected the whole blended image. The advantage of working, of course, in Camera Raw is that you're working on the raw file itself, and you have a lot more flexibility. There's a lot more that you can do working on the raw image than using adjustment layers and so on, working on sort of a completed blend. So I could go into any one of those 3 layers, open them in Camera Raw, make some further fine tuning, maybe the sky layer, which is the dark layer. It's this layer here, middle layer. Maybe I want to warm it up. Maybe I want to, maybe not have it quite as blue, make some changes. I can make that at the raw level and have that change reflected in my final blended image. So I can now separately adjust, fine-tune each of those layers, the bright layer, the dark layer, or the base layer. And I can adjust each of those in Camera Raw and then have the resulting image changed accordingly. And again, that is much faster than looking at my blended image, deciding, well, I didn't get the original exposures quite right, closing it out, going back to Lightroom, making some adjustments, opening it up, starting the whole blend process again. This is far quicker and essentially accomplishes the same thing. So this brings us to the fourth and final use, certainly not the final use of smart objects, but just the final one that I want to show you today in this sort of quick introduction into some of the things you can use smart objects for. And so that is using tools such as Transform or Liquify. And this can be quite a powerful use of smart objects. So here's my blended image in Photoshop again. Now, because I took this with a wide-angle lens, of course there's a bit of keystoning. You notice that the walls look like they're leaning inwards. And let's say I want to straighten that out a bit. Well, now that I've got a blended image, if I try using click on the top layer and try using the transform tool, that is only going to transform that one layer, which is going to really look weird. I might straighten out the walls, but you'll see the other layers from below showing through, and of course those walls haven't been straightened, and frankly it's going to be a mess. So and if I want to transform this image, I have to transform all 3 of those layers together. Straighten the walls on all 3 of them in concert with each other. One way you might do that is to create a stamp layer. Again, those are familiar with it. That's your Alt, Control, Shift, and E keys. Do all of that together, and you'll create a stamp layer. Or again, if you have the TK7 panel, you just click on this button here, and it creates that stamp layer for you. So there's another reason for Tony Kuiper's panel. If you have it, it certainly gives you a lot of shortcuts. Anyway, this isn't a sales pitch on the panel. I just find it my own workflow extremely useful. Anyway, so now I have this stamp layer. I can go Control T and bring up the transform tool. And then if I press Control, it changes into sort of the warp mode, and I can start pulling on the corners and different parts of the image to straighten out those walls. To make it look a little more realistic. And I'll just accept that. It's not perfect by any means, but just it's quick and dirty. But the disadvantage of doing this stamp layer is basically you've created a new pixel layer now. And now if I want to go back and make some more changes at the raw level on one of these base layers, let's say I want to warm it up a bit, click on one of these layers and warm it up. That's all happening below this pixel layer, this new pixel layer, and none of that is going to be visible. And I think I can add layers above and start making changes, but essentially this stamp layer blocks anything from below showing through. You've sort of created a new starting point in your image stack. In fact, in reality, I could now delete out those bottom 3 layers and it wouldn't impact anything because I've sort of baked everything into this stamp layer. So that's one way of doing it, but it's not the best way of doing it because it does restrict you if you want to make some further changes to the underlying layers. And that would include, even if I had added some adjustment layers and so on above these the blended layers and made some changes, maybe cloned out some stuff, done some adjustments on a curves layer and whatnot. All of that would be baked into this image, and if I went back and tried to adjust one of those adjustment layers further, again, it wouldn't show up in this this layer here. It essentially blocks or overrides anything that comes below it. So I'm going to get rid of that layer and show you a different way of using the transform tool. So I did show you earlier of how you can combine a number of levels, or pardon me, a number of layers, and sort of create a new smart object. And that's what I'm going to do here. I've highlighted those 3 layers, and I'm going to click on Convert to Smart Object, or again with the TK7 panel, I could just click on that button underneath the little revolving circle there. I'd click on that button and it would do the same thing, so it's one click. And in a moment here it will combine those 3 layers into a new smart object. Okay, now we have them combined into one new smart object. And now I can use the transform tool on this new smart object. So I'm just going to use Control T to bring up the transform tool. And press the Control key and then again dragging the corners to straighten the walls a little bit. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Again, kind of quick and dirty, but you kind of get the idea. Okay, so now that's fine. I've straightened the walls, But how do I change those underlying layers now? Let's say I wanted to warm up the image a little bit, particularly the walls, make it look a little more like the sun was starting to come up. Well, as we showed you earlier, if I double click on the thumbnail here, double click on the thumbnail, and it will open up that smart object as a new image, I guess you want to call it that. It kind of opens up the layers that are included within this smart object as a new image that I can now go in and make some adjustments to. Of course, it's taking Photoshop a moment to do this. But now it has opened up that new layer, and of course, notice that we're back because we're sort of working within that previous image. Notice that the walls are back to being angled, tilted inwards and so on. That's because we're back in those original smart object layers. And so again, let's say I want to maybe warm up the base image. So I'm going to double click on that bottom layer and open it in Camera Raw. And here in Camera Raw, I'm going to warm up the image and then click on OK, which will take us back into Photoshop. And you'll notice that in a moment, that change we made, there we go, the parts of the image, particularly you can really see it in the walls, that warming has been applied. And now, if we save this, of course, as we did before, this will save these changes back into that combined smart object in the original image. So either go up to File and down to Save, or just click Control, or this is Command S, and it will start the saving process, which will take a moment because we're recording and that slows everything down. Okay, it's finished saving now. So I can close this image because the changes I made here have all been saved back into a master file. So I'll close that out. And it's just doing a little bit of updating. Take a moment. And in another moment, that layer will close. Okay, and here we are back in the master file. Notice there's just the one layer, the smart object layer there, but keep in mind that those other layers are all embedded within this single smart object layer here. But interestingly, notice that the change is applied, so the walls look a little warmer than they did before, but the transforming I did, of course, it kept that change because I made it on this layer. The warming I did in the embedded layers, and so I don't have to go back and change any of the warping, the transforming I did on this layer. And even though in some cases, essentially I kind of stretched and dragged and pulled the pixels in that layer, the changes I made to the embedded layers came through and everything looks fine. So if I just go back in history, there was my blended image Next, go back here. So there's the original 3 blended images, and then I converted that to a smart object, and then I applied free transform, straightened out the walls, and then I opened the smart object into sort of the sub layers, or I opened up the embedded layers in there and warmed up the base layer, which sort of warmed up the wall in the foreground a bit, and here's the final result. So this was before I applied the warming. This was just when I did the straightening of the walls. Then I went into or opened up the smart object, made some changes to the temperature of the base layer, and there's the result. So here I applied, and I could have used the liquefy tool or various other tools on this layer here, and I still have access to go back into the layers that are embedded in to the smart object. I can make changes to those layers, or I could even go back into there and add some more adjustment layers. I could even do some cloning in that, and then when I saved it all back into here, into the main image, those changes would be showing, and so would the original straightening of the walls I did. So this gives you a method of retaining access, in a sense, to those underlying layers, but still being able to do some things like transforming in various ways, or liquefying using the liquefy tool. Some of the different tools that normally you have to use on a pixel layer. So that's been a very kind of quick overview of a few things you can do with smart objects. Hopefully it has tweaked your interest a little bit. A lot of you are probably familiar with using smart objects as a means of retaining the camera raw, but there's so much more, and I've just sort of scratched the surface here. There is a lot more that you can do with smart objects, which just brings me to my final comment. If you really want to learn more, Sean Bagshaw has an excellent course on smart objects, and that's actually the course I took and learned this and a lot more techniques. And it's amazing, again, just what you can do, how you can use smart objects in your workflow. And they are a tremendously powerful way of dealing with a number of different issues in Photoshop. So, sadly, I'm not getting a commission for promoting Sean Bagshaw's course, but I can tell you from personal experience that it's, if you're interested in exploring smart objects further, it's money well spent, because you will learn a lot. So that's basically what I want to cover. I'll exit the recording now and go live, be able to answer any questions that you may have.